Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maynard Karka, Vice President of COPA and Chairman of Freedom Innovations, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. COPA is very excited about the opportunity to host the webinar, which is entitled Facilitating Outstanding Patient Care, presented by Kevin Sims. During the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to learn how to provide the best clinical care and outcomes for your patients, grow your practice, and face any reimbursement challenges that come your way. Kevin will share his knowledge gained from personally reviewing over 20,000 patient charts for advanced technology products that has provided him the confidence to meet any reimbursement challenge, and he can provide this support for you to gain this knowledge and to gain this confidence as well. Kevin is the founder of O&P Consulting, where he provides consulting services including education, business growth, compliance, outcomes, coding, billing, and chart review for high technology orthotic and prosthetic devices. Kevin was formerly Director of Clinical Operations at Hanger, where he was responsible for the company's national microprocessor controlled knee and foot program. Previous to that position, he was Director Clinical and Scientific Affairs at Hanger. Kevin is a graduate of the University of Salford in the UK, where he received his Bachelor of Science degree, with honors in prosthetics and orthotics, and he is a certified orthotist and licensed prosthetist orthotist. I've had the pleasure of knowing Kevin for over a decade, during which time I've always found him to be informative and humorous, even though it is British humor that he will subject us to today. So Kevin, at this time, I will turn the webinar over to you. Kevin?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very kind introduction. So, man, it seems that there's only yourself that I can see on screen. If you'd be kind enough to nod if you can hear me. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call today. I really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you guys. A couple of things up front. I don't have all the answers. Probably more importantly, I don't know what you don't know. So I'd like to help you in any way that I can. But what I don't want to do is waste your time. The reason for the title is because this presentation is not bounded by to talk about revenue and profit and loss, etc. It's about literally that, facilitating outstanding patient care, which is what we all came into this wonderful profession for. Let me see if I can get on to the next slide. Perfect. So today, these are the areas we're going to look at. I'm going to try and whiz through some of the stuff that I think to be not quite so important. Please ask questions anytime you come across something you need some more information on. We can also do some Q&A at the end. So I'm not going to take up the whole time with you just having to listen to my boring old English voice. So we're going to look at all of those areas, background through to opportunities. So let's get started. Pardon me. Maynard kindly covered this, so little point in actually going through it again. Basically, I've been a clinician for a little over 22 years, and my current role is with O&P Serve in a consulting capacity. So more importantly, again, some of those professional areas that I was responsible for within Hanger. And again, Maynard touched on all of those very kindly. And the bottom bullet point is of course, the most relevant one. Basically, we took clinicians soup to nuts through high dollar, typically microprocess control knee, microprocess control foot provision. And that would, in some situations, involve a lot of hand holding, and others maybe not quite so much. It was basically the whole process as a separate business within Hanger, if you like, which was a whole chunk of fun, and I learned an awful lot. And since leaving Hanger, I've been very lucky to be able to bring some of this experience to the O&P world outside of Hanger. which is really interesting and a lot different in a good way. So I work with manufacturers, the O&P community to assist in getting high technology devices approved and reimbursed. I provide education. And more recently, I'm very excited to be able to tell that I've been invited onto the team at Mayo Clinic, where we're setting up a lower limb limb loss and preservation registry that is particularly exciting. So hopefully you'll have heard something about that. If not, I can get you some information as and when, perhaps separate to today's presentation. So into the history. We all remember the history, 2015, Armageddon, if you like. We all got hit up with racks, with Z-Picks, with prepay reviews, and none of us knew what day it was, let alone where we were, because we were just inundated with letters and documents from Medicare and denials, etc. So clearly, O&P providers struggled, and the net result was a negative effect on high technology O&P provision. So I guess most of you know the answer to the why, but we can go through some of that. Basically, it was a situation where folks ran scared, not particularly confident that the next microprocess control knee or foot was going to get paid. So we kind of moved away from that. Pardon me. Moving forward into where we are now, I figured it's worth looking at the current risk factors. Many of these remain the same or similar, and some of which we've mitigated because of our improvements. But basically, poor or incomplete clinician documentation, a lack of understanding of the basics of what we need to provide in terms of documentation to comply with Medicare, for instance, rules. In other words, their local coverage determination. Lack of understanding of the CMS policy, where they're going, what they're looking to do, and lack of provision of medical necessity. A lot of the time, incorrect coding, and we'll come back to incorrect coding because your coding may well indeed be correct insofar as in relation to the specific features of a device that you look to provide. The reality is Medicare may have a different opinion, and unfortunately, Medicare own the bat, the ball, and the playing field, and of course now they're choosing the music, so that being the codes. So we have to understand what particular codes we can reasonably expect to get reimbursement for, and which codes might cause us some difficulty. And lastly, the lack of supportive corroborative physician documentation. This is a biggie. A lot of folks are still handing their complete documentation to a physician and saying to the physician, would you sign and date this, or would you review this and provide some notes? And the physician glazes over and simply says, I have no idea what you'd like me to provide. So there are better ways of doing that, and I'll hopefully take you through some of those. But I put together a few schematics in the presentation just so that we could brighten it up a little and folks could get a better understanding of what's going on. Some folks learn by reading, as folks prefer pictorial, and that's fine. So if you look at the reduction in utilization of high-end devices, microprocess control knees, microprocess control feet, etc., I've tried to list these in terms of the most, the biggest shadow that they cast, in effect. Fear of audit would prevent folks from going down the route of this outstanding patient care that patients in many cases do qualify for and would benefit from. So when you have a fear of audit, you obviously follow with reduced confidence in being reimbursed. You'll maybe start to play safe and go with a non-microprocessor controlled device, perhaps for the initial prosthesis, when maybe previously you would go for that device for the patient's first prosthesis, which, by the way, Medicare will pay for if indeed your documentation meets the requirements. So if you're playing safe and you're not using that particular device, you're going to lose the habit. Stop using the muscle, it begins to go away. Add that to increased materials costs and reducing reimbursement with the proliferation of managed Medicare plans, which are Medicare less a chunk. then your motivation to go in this direction might reduce if you're thinking, well, the difference between my purchase cost and my reimbursement is actually shrinking, so why should I go there? So the whole idea of this presentation is to give you some tools, some information that will hopefully get you to a better place. A little bit of information about market data. There's some conjecture in terms of the actual numbers. The best research I could find was between 5,000 and 6,000 microprocess control knees are provided annually. And that's roughly $150 to $180 million in terms of revenue. So it's quite a big chunk. Some information that would maybe help you benchmark where you are as a clinic or group of clinics. The larger providers are providing between 10 and 36%, sorry, between 30 and 36% of microprocess control knees. But you can see the range is quite large, 10 all the way up to 36, maybe even higher in some situations, but I haven't been able to confirm that at this point. So if you're one of the larger providers, you're probably used to providing this type of device regularly. You'll have programs, you'll have some assistance, some expertise available to you. And your fear factor may not be quite so high, perhaps. If you look down to the next level, 20 to 29, some of the smaller, larger groups of O&P providers outside of, the really big ones, they would have similar expertise, but not to the same level. So their utilization might be in that area. And then you've got the 10 to 19%, and that's a bit of an overgeneralization because there are a whole bunch of folks that, to my knowledge, are still not providing this type of technology for qualifying patients for fear of simply not being reimbursed. But 10 to 19% would be groups of maybe 1 to 5 clinic locations. So again, these are generalized numbers, and you may fall within or outside of that bell curve, but it's just to give you an indication, if you like. Shouldn't really be any great need to include a slide that talks about the benefits of increased utilization, but it's clearly based on better patient care. We should, as clinicians, and again, I'm trying hard not to stand on my soapbox here, but patients should receive the device that they would benefit from. I frequently ask clinicians to imagine that the person or patient that they're dealing with is their mom or their father. And the reason being is none of us would want anybody experimenting on our parents. But more importantly, we would not want to find after the fact that they didn't receive the device that they should have received. And of course, the person that you're treating in your clinic room is possibly somebody's mom or dad. So I would ask to maybe bear that in mind. It can be a tough ask sometimes, but we have to do what we can. I'm going to try and help you maybe get to that place a little bit easier. So the more you become familiar with high technology products, it's more of there's more of a likelihood you're going to consider that device. It's going to come to mind sooner rather than later. From a business perspective, you will see an increased revenue, and there's no incremental labor expense. So this is clear bottom line. And a thought from my perspective is if we could raise the bar across the country and get more of a comfort factor here, it's my opinion, and simply my opinion, that we could be providing up to 1,000 additional microprocess control knee units each year. And that's not lifting K2s into K3. That's not making stuff up. That's simply saying there are patients out there that are qualifying candidates and perhaps falling through the net. Just an example of what the incremental revenue growth could be is in the graph below. If you were to provide 5 microprocessor controlled knees instead of 5 non-microprocess control knees as part of an entire prosthesis, then the incremental revenue drop or plus is on average $25,000 per unit. So as you can see, if you provided 10, that's $250,000. So let's say I'm using incorrect figures, and let's say that number for 5 MPKs is $80,000. It's still a chunk more than you would be receiving, and you're still providing outstanding patient care. And ideally, if doing it in a way that meets Medicare's requirements, you will be paid and you will stay paid. So this brings me to, if you like, a confidence circle or confidence graphic, whichever way you'd like to look at it. You can enter this particular circle at any point and move forward, if you like. So it was something that I was asked to put together for a bunch of clinicians who were looking to understand where they sat within the current process. So if you look at the top, for instance, you may feel that you are in need of some guidance or support, in which case that would help you build relationships with patients and get them into a better situation, more of a comfort zone. With increased comfort zone, you might find, hey, I've got some questions. I'm going to need to speak with the manufacturer. You're more likely to provide a microprocess control knee. Your patients are likely to be more successful. So you can drop into this process anywhere around the actual circle, depending on your given position. And it might just be simply a case that you're looking for a business growth opportunity. And how do you get there? Well, you work clockwise from that particular point. So hopefully that's something that kind of makes sense, but we're going to come back to that in a different form moving forward. In terms of, I do apologize, my throat doesn't seem to want to work very well today. In terms of support, there are various degrees of support that is available to clinicians. My company works with clinics to provide education, etc. So you might find that all you need is some support in terms of documentation, or you're looking for simply improved outcomes, or your objective is just simply business growth, or all three. A couple of ways to go about doing this. We don't share our successes. We don't share our failures. We don't actually converse quite so much as we should do. And it may well be that half a dozen of you on the call are very comfortable with this process and would be quite happy to share with your colleagues how you do what you do and what makes you successful. And I think that's worth doing. But I have a few areas that I think are worth looking at. For instance, I would ask a question to the group that typically is, how many of you have had PT? And most folks in the room would put their hand up and say yes. And the next question would be, how long is the first appointment with the physical therapist? And of course, the answer is typically an hour. And the reason for that is the PT takes the first half hour to put together a care plan, a plan of care. So my question to the group is, do you have or do you put together a plan of care? Do you have something in mind in terms of a direction, or do you move from patient encounter to patient encounter and maybe not document where you're actually going? Imagine for a second you have a new prosthetic patient, recently amputated. They come to your clinic and you're thinking, well, they're definitely not a microprocess control knee candidate, but with the wind blowing in the right direction, some PT, some use of a non-microprocess control knee perhaps, some development, some time, that they would progress to a microprocess control knee. I would suggest that you might want to include that detail in your initial documentation, because 6 to 18 months, maybe 12 months down the line, when you're going back to a microprocess control knee and you're asking the question, then you can reasonably refer back to your initial evaluation and share with whoever's reviewing your documentation. By the way, this was the plan all along. When we evaluated the patient, we covered this, and now we've come back with the evidence as to why this is a good idea. So it's not something that you pull out of a hat. And unfortunately, that's the impression that some insurance providers actually take of what we're looking to do, simply because it's a high dollar item and that there's an assumption or an expectation that we're looking to provide the most expensive device out there. So if you can, build a case as soon as possible. 3 areas that I'm looking for when I document a microprocess control knee. Is my patient in need of support to enable them to descend a ramp or incline, step over step? Is stumble recovery important? Does my patient need to sit down into a chair? And of course, most of you will smile and say, well, yeah. The reality is for amputees using a non-microprocess control knee, let's say to unilateral, they would approach a chair with hopefully 2 handles. They'll back toward the chair. They'll unweight their prosthetic size, semi-twist, and fall or flop into the seat and hope they don't miss. Any PT will tell you that that's an uncontrolled fall. And we all know that when we fit a microprocess control knee, one of the things we ask our patients to do is place the palms of their hands on their thigh, apply a flexion moment, and ride the resistance down into a seated position. Much safer, much more control. Everyone needs to sit down. We encounter ramps and inclines everywhere, and we would all prefer our patients not to fall. So if you can cover those 3 areas, you've gone a long way to providing good information to a reviewer, etc. But what you've got to ask, in addition to that, I asked 3 questions. For an existing prosthetic user, what is it about the current componentry that restricts my patient from completing their required activities of daily living? And what are those activities of daily living? And in my notes, I write activities of daily living, because a lot of folks out there don't necessarily understand, although you may smile, they don't necessarily understand what ADL might mean. So take that question off the table. Write it out in full. Activities of daily living. It takes just a little longer. So that's question 1. What is it about the existing componentry that holds my patient back from completing their activities of daily living? Question 2, what's the effect on my patient and their lifestyle if they are unable to complete any or all of those activities of daily living? Can't go to work, can't babysit the grandkids, can't go shopping, can't carry a bag of groceries. What is it? And thirdly, what is it about the device that's been prescribed that's going to help my patient and provide the how, the when, and the where? Now you just painted a picture of your patient, and that sets them apart from shall we say, a typical evaluation that may come across as a ask because, well, we think it's a good idea. But if you can back it up with this detail, then you will do a whole lot better with medical directors and reviewers. So hope that makes sense. I've got a couple more pieces of information that would be quite useful for you. One is a patient scenario, which we'll come back to in a moment or 2, if I can. Clinician decision-making is an area of great importance. On the left-hand side, you'll see this is a repeat of the information from slide number 8, where we had fear of audit all the way down to reduced reimbursement. On the right-hand side, you'll see balancing positives, as I would call them, that simply say, you can expect an audit. It's like a trip to the dentist. You know it's coming. You know it's potentially going to hurt. Nothing anyone is going to tell you is going to stop that. So be prepared for the audit. Practice what I call appeal avoidance. So be ready for it. But if you can, answer the questions you can thoroughly expect to receive in advance. So put yourself in the mind of the person reviewing the device. Make it make sense. Tell the patient's story and don't make it stand out for all the wrong reasons. An example would be, we've probably all had this patient. It's a new amputee. They've yet to receive a prosthesis, and they arrive at your clinic, and they turn up on crutches or a walker, and they are flying up and down the hall, clearly with variable cadence. And you take them into your gate room, and they hop across the room on one leg. They stand in the parallel bars whilst you take an examination, maybe 5 minutes whilst they're standing without assistance, or you may be taking a cast or carrying out range of motion or manual muscle tests, or whatever it is you need to do for the patient at that time. My question to the group is, when was the last time that you had a patient of that type, that you documented all of those amazing positives of commitment, ability, and capability that the patient has shown you already? If you put all of that detail down at your evaluation, and it goes along with the DX code of peripheral artery disease, then you just brought that patient to life for the person reviewing it. So if you can, what is it about the patient that you can tell the story about that separates and that differentiates them? Now, clearly not all of our patients are going to fit into that nice bracket, but there must be something. Maybe they didn't fly up and down the hall on crutches. Maybe they managed to get across the gate room unaided, or stood for 2 minutes, or did something to show some commitment and ability and functionality that you can document. Because what I find is when I chat with clinicians about patients and reviewing their documentation, the information is there in the clinician's head, just doesn't make it to the evaluation. And my job is to try and help you get to that point. So we're asking you to practice risk analysis. An example would be existing microprocessor control knee user, Medicare patient, been using a device for 5 years, the knee malfunctions, you get a cost estimate, the knee is clearly beyond economical repair and requires replacement. Patient still a functional level 3, you've got an outstanding evaluation that you've filled out, you've got pretty good physician notes. That's as close to a slam dunk as you can get. I would worry less about that. Other end of the scale, prosthetic user, DX code, maybe peripheral artery disease, etc. And you want to go 0 to hero with a microprocess control knee. Please, please, please engage the multidisciplinary team. Get a PM&R doc involved. Do an AMP-NO-PRO. Get a PT involved. Make sure that you can present this as a multidisciplinary approach to outstanding patient care. If you can do that, then you've gone a long way to actually meeting. In fact, you've gone further than Medicare requires, in my opinion, and you should have no difficulty in receiving reimbursement. So try to become the expert in the room by understanding reimbursement. Question for the group. How many of you have read and understand the local coverage determination from Medicare? Typically, if I was looking at the number of hands raised in a room, it would be 1 out of 25. It should be your nighttime reading. How can you document Medicare requirements without an understanding of what exactly they're looking for? So we talked about poor documentation. We talked about a lack of understanding of LCDs and lack of medical necessity, incorrect coding. Are you aware, for instance, if you throw a $59.99 onto the billing for a high dollar item and that $99 gets denied, that Medicare will come back and deny the device level? You will lose the lot. So I'm not suggesting the $99 isn't valid and an appropriate code for a feature or item that you're providing. Can you expect to be paid? We've moved on from the days of code it and we'll get paid to what are we going to get paid for? So we have to understand and do that balancing act, that risk analysis, and make sure that you're answering those questions before they're asked, as we described. So how do you do that? Well, you provide the fullest documentation that's required based on an understanding of the local coverage determination. If you need help in that area, I can help you. My contact details are at the end of this presentation. If you fail to explain why the device is such a great idea and do not answer CMS questions, you're leaving the door open. And you might be able to put a good story together, but are you making it make sense? Is it something that someone could read and understand. So take your evaluation and hand it on to someone else in the office. If it makes sense to them, probably will make sense to a reviewer. And how much supporting documentation is required? Well, that's case dependent based on that risk analysis. So if you need some assistance in those areas, I could probably help you there too. Coding review, that's fairly straightforward stuff. Beware, manufacturers' recommended coding doesn't necessarily always align to what you're going to get paid for by Medicare. Back to the graphics. If you can, engage in chart review. If you can get some assistance with documentation if required, then you will do better. You will have increased confidence. Your utilization should increase. You can't do a whole lot about the increasing materials cost. You can't do a whole lot about the reduction in materials, but you can affect how things move forward if you choose to ask the question and engage and start to look at your documentation like it's a story. We've gotten to be a little checkbox happy, and it would be a good idea if we probably moved away from that. If you remember the old SOAP notes, you can bring some of those SOAP notes and that SOAP note mentality to your current EHR. I'm not suggesting you bin your current EHR and start going back to paper, but you can include that information. For instance, let's say you're replacing a foot. I have a few, if I can find the paper that refers to that. I have a few tips, if you like, that will help you. So if you look at socket, knee, and foot, let's start with the foot. So typically some of the things that pop up when I look at evaluations, if you don't tell the patient story, it is an issue. But I see regularly a reason to replace a current foot, showing signs of delamination. I would invite you to come down off the fence and make your mind up. Is it delaminating or not? If it is, could you take a digital pic and could you include in your notes that that's what you've actually done? Medicare won't be able to receive a digital pic, but they'll see that you've actually taken one, and that's part of your information, if you like. Patient wants a new foot because, well, we think it's going to break soon, and patient really hasn't got the time to actually go to clinic and will not take time off work, and et cetera, et cetera. We've all had that patient. You're going to need to make a better case than that. Example might be, has the patient's weight changed? Has it gone up or down 10 pounds? If it has, it's likely to be outside of that foot category, and you've already begun to make the case to replace that foot. If they've increased in weight, then the foot's going to feel soft, and vice versa if they've reduced in weight. So look for those pieces of information. Another poor way of describing it is when we're looking for another foot is a patient needs more functionality. It's one of those wishy-washy comments. What is it about the current foot that stops the patient doing what they need to do? And then add that detail. When you look at the knee, frequently, reason to replace a knee, it's out of warranty. Who cares? My question to the room, how many of you have a refrigerator that's 3 years old? Did you know it's out of warranty? And why haven't you replaced it? Because it's probably still working. And why is a prosthetic knee any different? Because that's the way a reviewer will look at this. So out of warranty doesn't matter. Out of warranty and malfunctioning and beyond economical repair, absolutely. That you're beginning to make a case at that point. Patient needs a microprocess control knee, and that's a great beginning point. What's the why and the when? Paint the picture. Is it in relation to stumble recovery, step over step, descent of an incline, or more controlled in a seated situation? Is the fact that they need to change their cadence due to some vocational as well as avocational activity a requirement? Include that detail, paint the picture. Another example, as of a reason to change the knee, my patient's a K3. Well, that's great. What are the patient's K3 activities? Again, make it make sense. onto the socket, and this is where it gets really interesting, because this is where these things fall down an awful lot. Remember, we talked about one code. If it's denied, the whole thing goes away. A lot of the time, it comes from the socket as well. Reason to change a socket, volume change. Well, that's great. How much change and from where? Can you provide the existing measurements and the previous measurements and show a difference? You might say, oh, well, I've never seen this patient before. I don't know the existing measurements. Take the question off the table. Put that in your notes. I don't have the existing measurements. And then they can't ask you the question. Or they can, but there's little point. Already added some padding to the socket, so it needs replacing. Did you confirm what you provided in terms of padding when you did it? Change in socket required. That's great, but did you confirm, and this is pivotal when you've made any adjustments to a socket, that socket has been adjusted multiple times and that no additional modifications to that socket will render it a better fit. Without that information, you are literally pushing water uphill. So a few details on the process, if you like. Make sure it meets and exceeds the LCD, that you are meeting the requirements of medical necessity. Make sure your coding is reviewed. And the physician documentation, and we said we're going to come back to this, I would take the evaluation that you have and one that you've spent more than a little time putting together, and I would write a summary of 5 or 6 lines, just one paragraph, and it would include things like, my patient has expressed a desire to ambulate. Patient is expected to benefit from the prescribed device. Current device requires replacement. Patient would definitely benefit from a microprocess control knee or similar if that's what you're looking for. Take that information to the physician and ask the physician to review, write in their own words, and get yourself a copy. Because if you ask them to sign your notes, it becomes a supply-generated document. We all know there's only one supply-generated document that Medicare will consider, and that's the detailed written order. We can provide that, and the physician is allowed to review, sign a date, and that becomes a detailed written order that Medicare will consider. It's not part of the medical record in the same way as documentation is, though. If you can follow those particular bullet points, you're going to do really well. Where I come into the equation is I might look at your documentation up to that point, and I might recommend some changes and updates, and then offer a further review, and then ideally confirm that your chart is complete and compliant. And you may or may not choose to take that advice. That's, of course, your call. So with that, my contact details, as you can see, hopefully I haven't overrun. We should have hopefully some time for some questions or go into a few of these areas with a little more detail. So now I'm going to find out how to stop the share. There we go. We're back. Maynard, could you hear me, sir?
I can, Kevin. I believe everyone else on the line can as well. So if those of you who can access your chat box, either at the bottom of the screen or at the top of the screen, please feel free to jot Kevin a note and ask any question, and we'll try to respond to each of those.
Thanks, Maynard. I tried to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A because there's little point in listening to me go on forever. Yeah, I'll probably put people asleep. So the Q&A becomes probably more important. So by all means, folks, jump up with any questions and I will do my very best. Unless, of course, I put everybody to sleep. It's a huge topic. It's a huge area to discuss. And as we said at the top of the conversation, I don't know what you folks don't know. So hopefully there was at least something within that presentation for the folks on the line.
Well, Kevin, I don't see anything. I'll try to wrap up. I think we are just about on time to adjourn in another 3 or 4 minutes. So there we go. No, that's not this one. So, well, let me just wrap up, and if a question comes in, we'll continue and answer that. But I just want to thank you on behalf of everyone at COPA and everyone who's attended this webinar. I'm sure everyone found it very informative, and I hope that everyone found a tip or two that will help them provide the kind of care they want to provide for their patients with that increased confidence that they'll be able to withstand a reimbursement challenge and maybe even avoid that challenge. But I think one of your points was it's going to come, so be ready for it and handle it confidently. So there is a question here from J.R. Brandt, if I saw that correctly, or a couple of them that have come up. So Kevin, I'll just ask you to respond appropriately.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the kind words. Thank you. Slightly important to spend that time with patients. You can't shortcut the process. Great info. It's a great way of describing what actually goes on. If you're going to expect to be reimbursed $25,000, $35,000, $45,000, it is going to take that extra bit of time. Would that I could wish that we could do this in 5 minutes, but great to see that you clearly understand that it is going to require a do and a do-over. I see a few more questions coming in. Question or comment from Michael Johnson. I've seen in the past questionnaires that list the majority of what you're speaking to. Do you have a similar document available? I'm so happy you asked. The answer is I don't. And the reason being is it becomes a template. Medicare recognizes and picks up templates really quickly. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the content we've gone through today is spoken rather than written. Sounds like a cop-out and it's not meant to be. But I'd be happy to discuss with any of you individually or collectively if you have any questions around that. I just want to zip through these if I can. What are your recommendations for getting better notes from physicians without feeding them the required info? Again, it's that if you tell a story in the evaluation, put it together into a summary, a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs, and if need be, go along with the patient. But please don't hand that document over and ask the physician to sign and date it because you just made a rod for your own back. It is difficult and it's an educational process with physicians, but it is possible to get there. Let's see, J.R. Brandt, too often you rush to the next patient. Agreed. It's tough. The best way to do this perhaps is if you have some patients that are coming through the office that you space out your, shall we say, patients that are requiring more time.
Kevin, it seems that's it. Are you seeing another one?
There was a very kind thank you. I very much appreciate it. Now, if any more questions come in, please, we can maybe answer them and get them to the group rather than just answer to one person. It kind of grows then, if you like. But sincerely, thank you for putting this together. I appreciate you taking the time. If any of you have questions anytime, I'd be very happy to help.
Okay, with that, we will adjourn the meeting, but I want to once again thank you, Kevin, for a very informative presentation. I know for many of us, it sort of just whets our appetite to want to learn more. So hopefully everyone on the line was able to capture Kevin's contact information. If not, contact the COPA administrative office and we'll provide that for you. I'd like to thank everyone who attended today's presentation. I also want to remind you that we try to provide these presentations on a quarterly basis. So if there's a particular subject that you want addressed, please either contact me directly. Many of you, most of you have my direct contact information, so please feel free to reach out or send a note to COPA's administrative office, and we'll try to schedule it. If you're interested in it, likely many others are as well. So with that, we will adjourn the meeting, and I want to thank everybody, and hopefully we'll see one another at the AOPA National Meeting in San Diego the last week in September. So thank you all.
Look forward to it.
All right.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.